Welcome to the final module of the structured interview training. In this training, we will cover how to evaluate candidates, equal employment opportunity guidelines, and interview material security. You have now been introduced to best practices for conducting effective interviews, as well as behavioral note-taking and questioning techniques. As we discussed in the last module, learning proper note-taking and questioning techniques is important to ensure there is proper evidence and documentation for evaluating the candidate. In this module, you will learn about how to use these notes to ensure an accurate and justified evaluation of the candidate. You will also learn about important laws related to the employment process and how to keep the interview materials safe and secure to ensure the integrity of the interview is maintained. Let's begin by talking through the process of evaluating and rating a candidate. The first step is to review the behavior-based notes you took that document the candidate's responses to the predetermined questions. This should be done immediately following the interview. When evaluating, each question the candidate answered must be evaluated using its own assigned rating scale for the competency. The rating scale will include examples of specific behaviors called behavioral anchors. Each of these anchors is important to the competency being rated. You will be asked to evaluate the candidate on whether they demonstrated these behaviors on a scale ranging from poor to average to outstanding performance. These rating scales, including the relevant competency behaviors, will be provided to you in the interview guide. In order to rate the candidate on the provided scales, you will look at the behavioral anchors in the rating scales and determine which statements best describe the candidate's response. You will then decide on a single numerical rating for a competency based on how the candidate's answer matches the behavioral anchors within the competency rating scale. If a candidate is between rating levels, the rater should do his or her best to determine whether the candidate is at the low end of one rating or the high end of the other. If a candidate is unable to provide any behavioral statements for the competency, the candidate should be rated a 1 for the competency rating. It is important to remember that each interviewer should complete the initial individual scoring sheet without discussing his or her opinions with anyone else. This ensures the interviewers are not influenced by anyone else's opinions before forming their own opinion of the candidate. Each interviewer should circle the corresponding level of effectiveness that best matches the response given by the candidate. Once a rating has been made, interviewers should document the decision. This rating documentation should include concrete examples from the candidate's answers given to questions or behaviors that were observed for the competencies. An explanation for how answers are related to the behavioral anchors in the rating scale, and why the response deserves the given rating. Statements such as, the candidate's responses were in the good category, so I gave him a 4 rating, are insufficient to document a rating. Rather, the documentation must cite specific examples of what the candidate said or did during the interview. Now let's talk through an example. I'd like you to grab a piece of paper and to take some behavioral notes as I read you a candidate's response to a question concerning decision-making. These notes will come in handy when you are asked to rate the candidate on the next slide. Please pause the recording now if you need additional time to gather materials. Mark was asked about a time when there was a small problem at work that needed to be fixed. His response was as follows. When I worked in a large retail store, the standard procedure was to leave a product on the shelf until it ran out, then place more items out. This practice obviously wasted a lot of man hours. Of interest particularly to me were the air conditioners. Not only did I have to put the heavy things on the shelves, but they were selling at a very high rate. So if somehow AC units ran out on a day in which I could not restock them, they would not be available to customers. As a result, I started making a list of products, including the AC units, that the overnight stock people could put on the shelves. As a result, the people on duty always had a job to do, so labor hours were not wasted, and the shelves were always stocked full of product. Now I'd like you to take a minute to decide how you would rate Mark on the positive and negative indicators you see on the screen. For this response, Mark has shown that he acts decisively, takes responsibility for his own tasks, and takes responsibility for the work of others. As raters, we don't have much information about whether he acted quickly, so we might not make a specific judgment on that particular behavior. In the notes section, we might say something like the following to justify our overall rating. Mark resolved an issue of wasted man hours and products not always being stocked on the shelves by starting a list of products that overnight stock workers could put on the shelves. By doing this without being asked, he showed that he takes responsibility for his own work as well as the work of others, and that he has the initiative and ability to make decisions for a group of people. Mark showed most but not all the behaviors, so I've rated him as a 4. Because Mark showed most but not all of the desired behaviors, we might rate him as a 4 overall. Let's talk next about some common rater biases that should be avoided. First, halo error. This type of error occurs when a rater makes similar ratings across competencies based on a general impression of the candidate. Instead of making judgments based on your impression of the candidate, be sure to take very detailed behavioral notes as discussed in Module 2. Base all ratings on these notes instead of any of your own evaluations or opinions. Second, leniency or severity. This type of error occurs when raters tend to use only one part of the scale, so all ratings occur at the high end of the scale, or all ratings occur at the low end of the scale. Instead, raters should attempt to use the full range of the scales on both the high and low end, as well as the middle when the candidate's behaviors call for it. Closely related to the leniency severity error, the central tendency error occurs when raters tend to rate candidates only in the middle of the scale. Again, raters should strive to use the full range of the scale based on the candidate's observed and documented behaviors. Stereotyping is an additional common error. Stereotyping occurs when candidates are rated on things that are unrelated to the job, such as ethnicity, gender, and physical appearance. This error also includes rating candidates on things like tattoos, piercings, and unusual hair color. All of these things are unrelated to job performance and should not be considered or documented when rating a candidate. First impression error. This type of error occurs when raters allow either their first impression of a candidate or the most recent interaction they have had with the candidate to overly influence their evaluation. Again, to avoid this error, raters should take very detailed behavioral notes and base all ratings on these notes instead of any evaluations or opinions. Contrast effect. This type of error occurs when the contrast between candidates influences the ratings assigned. For example, this error occurs when an average candidate is compared to a great candidate who interviewed first. The average candidate would be rated lower due to the comparison to the great candidate who went first. To avoid this error, raters should stick very closely to the behavioral anchors and base all ratings on the level of behaviors demonstrated by the candidate instead of comparing candidates to each other. Now we're going to cover the do's and don'ts of evaluating and rating a candidate. Do base your ratings for each competency on all of your notes for that competency. This includes reviewing all of your notes for each competency after the interview is over, using notes to determine the rating that best matches the candidate's responses for each competency, and looking for specific statements that describe what behaviors or actions a candidate took to address the situation discussed for each question. Do base ratings solely on factors related to the competencies being rated. Make sure to focus on the candidate's responses to the questions. Avoid rating candidates on things unrelated to the job, such as ethnicity, gender, or feeling of chemistry between the interviewer and the candidate. Also, resist making snap judgments based on your first impression of the candidate. Focus on each candidate's responses to each of the interview questions. Keep in mind that raters tend to weight answers at the beginning and end of the interview more heavily. Try to avoid this tendency when completing your ratings. Do not make common rater errors. This includes not allowing your ratings to be affected by general feelings or impressions of the candidate. Try not to judge candidates based on their physical appearance, including tattoos, hair color, or piercings. These are irrelevant to job performance. Don't allow the candidate's overall performance or performance on a different competency to affect the score you assign to a specific competency. Instead, focus on rating one competency at a time. Don't forget that everyone has strengths and weaknesses, and ratings should reflect both of these qualities across the interview. Do not compare one candidate to another. Each candidate's effectiveness should be determined by comparing the candidate's responses to the standards provided on the rating scales, not by comparing candidates to each other. For additional information on the exact rating process, please refer to the interview guide that will be provided with your interview questions and rating scales. Now let's talk about equal employment opportunity law. As active participants in the hiring process, it is important that all interviewers are aware of the legal requirements of employment. There are several major acts, titles, and regulations that prohibit discrimination against protected classes of individuals. First, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This title prohibits discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Personal factors such as these are not relevant to employment status and should not influence how interviews are conducted or rated. Next, the Age Discrimination in Employment Act of 1967. This act prohibits discrimination based on age. Do not assume that older candidates will not be able to keep up or that their experience automatically makes them more qualified than younger candidates. Also, do not assume that younger candidates are too immature to handle a job position based on age alone. The Americans with Disabilities Act. This act requires that individuals with disabilities are given the same considerations for employment that individuals without disabilities are given. For this reason, interviewers should focus questions only on relevant and essential job duties. Evaluate candidates based on only job-relevant competencies, not on stereotypes about the capabilities of disabled persons. Be sure not to make notes regarding a candidate's general physical or mental characteristics. Finally, other acts, titles, and regulations also prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation, genetic information, and parental status. Personal factors such as these are not relevant to employment status and should not influence how interviews are conducted or rated. During an interview, if a candidate volunteers information about his or her race, religion, or other protected characteristic, the interviewer should tell the candidate that this information is not relevant to the interviewing process and will not be considered when evaluating the candidate's interview. The only interview questions that should be asked are those questions chosen from the interview guide or those developed by the hiring manager using guidelines provided for creating new questions. Spontaneous questions should be avoided. Spontaneous questions are not the same as follow-up or probing questions, which you have been trained to ask in Module 2. Spontaneous questions are questions that would be considered completely unrelated to the predetermined script and would not be asked of every candidate. If you have a need to create a new question that should be asked of every candidate, please speak to your recruiter or HR department. They have a question development guide that can be used to create consistent, job-relevant, legal interview questions. Finally, let's talk about keeping the interview secure. The structured interview protocols, including the question bank, behaviorally anchored rating scales, and candidate responses, are considered to be strictly confidential. If a candidate were to gain access to the interview questions or rating scales, he or she would have an advantage over other candidates. Therefore, it is imperative that interviewers keep these interview materials in a secure location at all times. Interviewers are responsible for returning all materials immediately to the recruiter in a sealed envelope marked confidential. The recruiter then logs the results digitally, and the paper copies are shredded. Only people who have successfully completed the structured interview training are authorized to handle the interview materials. If released, the information contained in the structured interview could compromise the development and integrity of the interview and its ability to evaluate Wills Group candidates. Interviewers should ensure that candidates and other unauthorized persons are never left alone with the materials. Now that you've completed all 3 modules, let's do a quick check of your learning. For the following, you may feel some of these questions are silly and may never happen. However, these types of things happen more often than you might think. Answer the following true or false questions to ensure your understanding of the previous training is complete. Number 1, the best candidate is the neatest in appearance. False. Don't judge a book by its cover. Physical appearance is not related and should not be considered when evaluating candidates. Number 2, you should study the competencies and interview guide before conducting an interview. True. By reviewing the competencies and studying the interview guide, you will appear prepared and professional when conducting the interview. Number 3, it is your responsibility to maintain control of the progress of the interview. True. If you don't maintain control of the interview, it could get out of hand and become little more than a meaningless conversation. Number 4, during the interview itself, you should do about 50% of the talking. False. Always remember you cannot learn anything while talking. The candidate should talk most of the time, and you should keep your part down to about 20% of the interview time. Number 5, to conduct a smooth flowing interview, you must first put the candidate at ease. True. This is one of the key factors in good interviewing. A tense candidate is a non-communicative candidate. Therefore, good rapport should be established before beginning the interview. Number 6, a good way to commence an interview is to challenge the candidate to prove he can do the job. False. This will only antagonize the candidate and reduce your chances of building rapport. This often leads to the candidate becoming frustrated, defensive, and non-communicative. Number 7, specific interview questions should be framed to elicit yes or no responses. False. Open-ended questions are designed to probe deeply and to elicit more and better information. Yes or no questions should be avoided. Number 8, candidates can be encouraged to elaborate on their answers by your use of silence or non-committal remarks. True. These non-directive techniques are very effective when used properly. Candidates hate the sound of silence and often try to fill the dead air with additional comments. Number 9, a nervous candidate should be disqualified because he or she probably would not be able to cope with a stressful job. False. The interviewing process itself can cause nervousness, and it may have little relationship to a person's ability to perform on the job. You can eliminate most nervousness when you establish proper rapport. Number 10, hiring managers in most companies are excellent interviewers. False. Hiring managers often have received little or no training on how to conduct interviews. All people in a company who interview candidates should be given training. Number 11, evaluative notes concerning general impressions of the candidate should be included in the rating documentation. false. Evaluative notes are often based on common rater biases. Only behavior-based notes regarding the situation, action, and result should be included in the rating documentation. Number 12, questions from the interview guide should be read word for word. True. The questions are designed to measure job-relevant competencies and to maintain consistency across all candidates, allowing all candidates to experience a fair interview process. This concludes our training on evaluating and rating candidates, equal employment opportunity law, and interview security. If you would like additional interview-related resources, please reach out to your talent acquisition team.